Imagine the year is 1628. The bells of a cathedral toll above a fog-choked town square in Germany. The people gather not for a festival, nor for the crowning of a ruler, but for something far darker. A woman, no older than 30, is dragged forward in chains. Her hair has been shaved, her clothes torn away, and her wrists bleed where the iron shackles bite into her flesh. She is accused of a crime that no evidence can prove, and no defense can refute: witchcraft. At her side stands an inquisitor, draped in black, clutching a book that would shape Europe's most chilling century of fear, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. Published in 1487, it declared that women were more prone to witchcraft because they were supposedly weaker, more carnal, more easily tempted by the devil. It was not merely a book, it was a death warrant, legitimizing the torture and execution of tens of thousands of women across Europe. The air is thick with silence as the woman is fastened onto a wooden chair, its seat and back studded with iron spikes. This was called the iron chair, one of many devices crafted not only to inflict pain, but to degrade, to strip a human being of dignity, and to force words from her mouth that might never have been spoken otherwise. As the villagers look on, they are not simply spectators. They are witnesses to the machinery of fear, a machinery that turned communities against their daughters, mothers, and neighbors. Witch hunts were not isolated frenzies of madness. They were organized campaigns, rooted in law, endorsed by church authorities, and justified as holy duty. From the witch trials of Würzburg and Bamberg in Germany, to Scotland, France, and beyond, entire regions were consumed by the paranoia that Satan's servants walked among them, and in nearly every case, the victims were women. To understand the true horror of this era, we must look beyond the accusations and into the chambers where screams echoed against stone walls. Here, devices of torture became instruments of truth. The thumbscrew, crushing bones until only splinters remained. The pear of anguish, a grotesque metal fruit forced into the mouth or body, expanded with a twist of iron. The witch's bridle, locking a woman's tongue behind spikes so that any attempt to speak tore her flesh. These were not inventions of sadistic criminals. They were sanctioned by law, built by craftsmen, and used under the watchful eyes of priests and magistrates. To those who wielded them, they were instruments of salvation, tools to purify the body and soul from the devil's grip. To the women who endured them, they were the very embodiment of hell on earth. This is the story of how Europe's witch hunters used terror, faith, and iron to control women's bodies and silence their voices. And it begins in the darkest corners of medieval and early modern Europe, where fear of the devil was rivaled only by the cruelty of the devices forged to drive him out. But the true horror was not simply in the pain these devices caused, it was in the twisted logic that made entire societies believe such. Cruelty was righteous. The witch trials of Europe were never only about heresy or demonic pacts. Beneath the sermons and the smoke of burning pyres, they were about something more intimate, more dangerous. The power of desire and the terror of losing control over it. For centuries, the church had painted women as the weaker vessel, Eve's daughters, whose bodies and voices were gateways for sin. They were accused not simply of sorcery but of seduction. Inquisitors claimed that women bewitched men with beauty, lured them into sin, and conspired with demons through forbidden pleasures. In reality, these accusations revealed far more about the fears of men than about the women they condemned. Sexuality was turned into a weapon, to speak too freely, to refuse marriage, to live independently. Any of these could invite suspicion. A midwife who understood herbs, a widow who owned property, or a girl who spurned a suitor could be branded as dangerous. The mere act of existing outside the boundaries of obedience was enough to mark a woman as a witch. And so, devices of torture became instruments of control. The scold's bridle, also known as the witch's bridle, was a cruel cage of iron locked around a woman's head, a spiked plate pressed down upon her tongue. Every attempt to speak, whether to protest her innocence or cry out in pain, would shred her flesh. She would be paraded through the streets, silenced not only physically, but symbolically. Her voice, her defiance, her very identity was torn away. The psychology was as calculated as the ironwork. Torture was not only meant to extract confessions, it was meant to break the spirit, to force women into playing the role that society demanded of them. When a woman finally confessed to flying through the night, to lying with demons, to cursing her neighbor's crops, She was not revealing truth. She was surrendering under unbearable pain and humiliation. Desire itself was reframed as evidence of guilt. If a woman was beautiful, she was accused of tempting men into sin. If she was barren, she was accused of cursing fertility. If she resisted advances from men of power, she was labeled as bewitched by Satan. In each case, the underlying message was the same. Women's bodies did not belong to them, but to the community, the church, and the law. Even the tools of examination were tainted with this obsession. The so-called witch prickers were men paid to pierce women's flesh with long needles, searching for the devil's mark, a spot that would not bleed or feel pain. Stripped naked before strangers, women endured this degradation under the guise of holy investigation. Control, then, was the true heart of the witch hunts. Behind every accusation and every device was a system determined to remind women that their freedom was dangerous, that their words were dangerous, that even their beauty was dangerous. Torture was not simply punishment. It was indoctrination by fire and iron, forcing women into silence and obedience. But the hunts did not stop with nameless villages. Soon, entire towns would be consumed in flames, and scandals would rise from the highest levels of power, where politics, faith, and desire collided with devastating consequences. By the early 17th century, the witch hunts had reached their most brutal crescendo. Few places embodied this hysteria more than the German bishoprics of Würzburg and Bamberg. Between 1626 and 1631, these two regions became synonymous with terror, staging mass executions that devoured entire communities. The man who presided over Würzburg was Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg. Cloaked in the authority of both church and state, he believed himself to be waging a holy war against Satan's army on earth. His campaign of purification consumed not only peasants and widows, but nobles, students, and even children. In some villages, entire families were executed. The accused ranged from a 9-year-old schoolboy to the Prince Bishop's own nephew. The machinery of accusation was swift and merciless. A whisper from a neighbor, a failed harvest, or the illness of a child could set events in motion. Once accused, escape was nearly impossible. Prisoners were hurled into cells where darkness, filth, and despair gnawed at them, long before iron touched their flesh. Then came the torture chambers. In Würzburg and Bamberg, instruments of cruelty stood ready. The thumbscrew, a small but vicious device, crushed bone into splinters until fingers became useless stumps. The leg screw, or Spanish boot, compressed the shins with iron wedges driven deeper at each turn, sometimes shattering bone, the strappado, where the accused was hoisted by tied wrists behind her back, tearing shoulders from their sockets as she hung suspended in agony. Confessions flowed like blood. Under the twisting of screws and the snapping of joints, women admitted to impossible crimes, flying on broomsticks, feasting with demons, consorting with the devil himself. These were not truths uncovered, but stories manufactured under unbearable torment. Yet the church recorded them with solemn certainty, reinforcing the belief that witches were everywhere. One of the most haunting testimonies came from Dorothea Flock, a woman accused in Bamberg in 1629. Despite appeals from her husband and even letters from outside authorities, she was executed. Her pleas of innocence were silenced by the rack and the branding iron. To the authorities, her suffering was proof of guilt. To her family, it was the destruction of an innocent life. The scale of the trials was staggering. In Würzburg alone, nearly 900 people were executed over just a few years. Whole neighborhoods were emptied, estates seized, and children orphaned. Fear rippled outward, paralyzing society. People who might have spoken against the madness remained silent, terrified that they too would be branded as witches. Behind the veil of righteousness lay ambition and greed. Confiscated property enriched the prince bishops and their allies. Power was consolidated as rivals, and inconvenient voices disappeared in the smoke of the pyres. The witch trials were not only acts of religious paranoia, they were instruments of political and economic domination. But as the fires of Würzburg and Bamberg raged, something else began to emerge. A recognition that these devices of power and desire were shaping politics itself, drawing mistresses, courts, and rivalries into the deadly theatre of witchcraft accusations. Witch hunts were rarely random storms of hysteria. Behind the smoke of the pyres and the rattling of chains lay quieter games. Political manoeuvring, sexual rivalry, and power play. In the courts of Europe, Women who dared to wield soft power, mistresses, widows, midwives, or outspoken wives, were especially vulnerable. Their influence could shift alliances, sway rulers, or stir jealousy. To silence them, charges of witchcraft became a convenient blade. After all, how could one argue innocence when the devil himself was said to be your accomplice? Take the case of Katharina Henot, one of Cologne's most prominent postmistresses in the early 1600s. A woman of rare authority in a male-dominated world, she controlled networks of communication across the region. But her very independence made her dangerous. Rivals accused her of witchcraft, claiming she cursed those who opposed her. Under torture, she refused to confess. Yet refusal was itself interpreted as proof of guilt. In 1627, she was burned alive, her ashes scattered as a warning. Her death removed a powerful woman from the political stage and restored male dominance over her position. Such stories were not isolated. In England during the mid-1600s, the infamous Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, rose to prominence by exploiting local fears. But beneath the surface of his Puritan zeal, there was calculation. Hopkins profited directly from accusations. Towns paid him to rid them of witches. His reign of terror, especially in East Anglia, destroyed hundreds of lives, many of them women who resisted or challenged the strict codes of Puritan society. Hopkins's methods, such as swimming the accused, binding and casting them into rivers to see if they floated, blurred the line between piety and performance, justice and spectacle. Sexual politics fueled the cruelty. Women accused of seducing priests, tempting noblemen, or rejecting suitors were particularly targeted. Beauty could be as damning as age. A young woman might be accused of enchanting men with her looks, while an older widow might be branded as bitter, jealous, and spiteful. A witch who spoiled marriages and crops. In both cases, female autonomy was the crime hidden beneath the accusation. The torture chambers reflected this obsession with control. Stripping women naked before male inquisitors was framed as a necessity to search for the devil's mark, but it also served as ritualized humiliation. The so-called witch prickers, paid professionals, stabbed women's bodies with long needles to find insensible patches of skin. What was presented as sacred investigation was, in truth, a form of sanctioned violation. Behind the pyres and the shrieks of the tortured, rivalries burned just as fiercely. Witchcraft accusations cleared courts of inconvenient women, silenced mistresses who threatened political stability, and rid communities of figures who challenged established hierarchies. In this way, witch hunts became not only acts of religious hysteria, but calculated strategies of domination. And yet, outside the courts and palaces, the terror seeped into the streets and homes of ordinary people. Villagers, mothers, and children lived under the shadow of devices designed to break bodies and spirits. To see the true impact of this age of fear, we must step into daily life itself. While bishops and inquisitors orchestrated grand trials in stone chambers, the true weight of the witch hunts was felt in the humbler corners of Europe, in villages, kitchens, and marketplaces where suspicion poisoned daily life. For ordinary people, witchcraft was not an abstract theological debate. It was a constant living fear. A neighbor's cow went barren, a child fell ill overnight, a storm ruined the harvest. Eyes turned quickly toward the widow who muttered to herself, the midwife with knowledge of herbs, or the woman who quarreled too loudly in the town square. Accusation became a language of blame, a way to explain the cruel unpredictability of life. This meant that any woman who stood out risked becoming a target. The unmarried seamstress who kept to herself, the outspoken wife who argued with her husband, or the elderly crone whose face carried the lines of hardship, all could be transformed into witches in the popular imagination. The very traits that marked women as independent, strong-willed, or skilled were reinterpreted as evidence of dark pacts. The terror was not confined to the accused. Families lived under a cloud of dread. Children were questioned, sometimes tortured, and even executed alongside their mothers. Husbands might denounce wives to protect themselves. In some communities, entire households were erased. The paranoia fractured bonds of trust, replacing kinship and neighborliness with suspicion and fear. Everyday rituals became twisted by the shadow of witch hunts. Bathing, childbirth, cooking, all carried whispers of danger. Midwives, once trusted to guide women through the peril of childbirth, were branded as witches if an infant died, or if their knowledge of herbs seemed too effective. Women skilled in healing, who had once been vital to communities, became objects of terror. The The very wisdom that had sustained villages for generations was rebranded as sorcery. The double standards were stark. Among the elite, noblewomen often escaped the full force of accusation, shielded by family power or political necessity. Among commoners, women had no such protection. The same behaviors tolerated or even admired in the upper classes became mortal sins in the villages. A flirtatious court lady might be seen as charming, while a flirtatious milkmaid could be condemned as demonic. The devices themselves, whispered about in hushed tones, became part of the cultural imagination. The thought of the iron chair, the thumbscrews, or the pair of anguish struck terror into households. Mothers warned daughters not to be too outspoken, not to gather herbs, not to risk standing out. Fear was not just in the torture chambers. It lived at the hearth, in the cradle, in the silence of women who learned that their survival depended on obedience. Archaeological discoveries and preserved instruments in European museums remind us that these were not ghost stories but concrete realities. Cold iron once pressed against living flesh. Screams once echoed through village squares. Communities internalized the lesson. Obedience meant survival, defiance meant death, but hysteria cannot burn forever. Eventually, the cruelty grew so extreme that cracks began to appear. The machinery of fear, once seen as righteous, was questioned. And the turning point came when the very excess of witch hunts forced society to confront its own darkness. By the early 17th century, the witch hunts had burned their way through towns and kingdoms, but their very excess began to plant seeds of doubt. For years, inquisitors had claimed that the confessions extracted under torture were holy truths. But as the body count rose and the stories grew ever more outlandish, whispers of skepticism began to spread. In some regions, entire villages had been emptied. Families who had lived side by side for generations were annihilated. Even children were hanged or burned for crimes they could not possibly have committed. Judges and scholars started to ask, if the devil's army was truly this vast, how had Christian society survived at all? The absurdity became impossible to ignore. The case of Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim, the Prince Bishop of Bamberg, is telling. Known as the Witch Bishop, he oversaw one of the bloodiest purges in Europe. His dungeons housed elaborate torture chambers, with devices like the leg screw and the rack used to wrench confessions from terrified prisoners. But his zeal became his undoing. Foreign envoys, disturbed by reports of noblewomen and children among the victims, pressured the Holy Roman Empire to intervene. In 1631, his power collapsed under scandal, and the trials he had championed were condemned as judicial murder. Elsewhere, doubts grew from within. In France, the jurist Jean Baudin had once written passionately in defense of hunting witches. Yet later, scholars began to challenge the logic of torture itself, noting that pain could force anyone to confess anything. The intellectual tide began, slowly, to turn. Across the Channel in England, the story of Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witchfinder general, shows how quickly fervour could curdle into backlash. Hopkins rose in the 1640s, feeding off Puritan paranoia and charging towns for his services. His reign of terror was brief but spectacular. Scores of women hanged, entire communities terrorized. Yet his methods, especially the notorious swimming test, in which women were bound and thrown into rivers, soon drew ridicule. When accusations of greed and corruption followed, his career ended abruptly. Hopkins himself died young, reviled as much as he had once been feared. Even in the New World, the hysteria met its limits. The Salem witch trials of 1692 echoed the patterns of Europe: accusations, torture, and executions. But the madness there collapsed within a year. When respected citizens, even ministers' wives, began to fall under suspicion, the absurdity became undeniable. Judges publicly confessed error, and the colony passed laws later condemning the trials. The turning point did not arrive because cruelty lessened. It arrived because cruelty grew so monstrous that it exposed its own lie. What had once been accepted as righteous became viewed as corruption. What had once been framed as holy duty was revealed as political opportunism, greed and fear disguised as justice. But when the smoke of the pyres finally cleared, Europe was not the same. The witch hunts had ended, but their consequences lived on, in the law, in the culture, and in the way women were seen for centuries to come. The most immediate legacy was legal. For generations, torture had been normalized as a judicial tool. Devices once crafted to force confessions from witches The thumbscrew, the rack, the pair of anguish, remained in use for criminals and political prisoners. The precedent was set. Pain could be equated with truth. Only slowly, through the Enlightenment and the rise of rationalist thinkers, did torture begin to lose its legitimacy in courts of law. Yet the stain of its use lingered, echoing in prisons and inquisitions long after the last witch trial. The cultural impact was equally profound. The witch hunts reinforced the idea that women's bodies were inherently dangerous, that their voices needed controlling, and that their independence was suspect. Healers, midwives, and wise women, once vital to communities, had been vilified as agents of Satan. Their destruction left a vacuum, one that centralized medicine in the hands of men and stripped women of authority in matters of health and childbirth. The legacy of fear became a justification for keeping women in submission long after the last pyre was extinguished. On a broader scale, the witch trials shaped Europe's identity. They became a grim symbol of what happens when faith, fear, and power combine unchecked. Entire regions bore the scars. Würzburg, Bamberg, Trier, Scotland, France, and beyond. Places where entire generations were marked by loss. Parish records reveal gaps where names vanish, lines of families broken, estates confiscated. The trauma was woven into folklore, whispered through lullabies and ghost stories, a cultural memory of neighbors turning against one another in the name of purity. The political reverberations were equally significant. Rulers had wielded witchcraft accusations to silence rivals and seize property, but in doing so, they exposed the fragility of their own authority. When the witch hunts collapsed, they left behind a skepticism toward religious and political institutions. This skepticism fed into the currents of the Enlightenment, where thinkers began asking hard questions about reason, justice, and the rights of individuals. In a sense, the brutality of the witch hunts helped provoke the very intellectual movements that would dismantle them. Even in modern times, the word witch hunt has not vanished. Instead, it has become a metaphor used to describe political purges, media scandals, and the persecution of those who challenge authority. The echo of Europe's torture chambers still haunts our language, a reminder of how easily fear can be manipulated into cruelty. Archaeological evidence and preserved devices in museums across Europe testify to this legacy. Behind the glass of display cases lie iron chairs bristling with spikes, bridles that silenced voices, and boots that crushed bone. They are not only relics of cruelty, but symbols of how entire societies can turn against their own under the weight of fear. But even as Europe moved into the modern age, the ghost of the witch hunts remained. The true question is not only what they did to women of the past, but what warnings they leave for us today. The pyres have long gone cold. The screams that once echoed through stone chambers have faded into silence. And yet, the story of Europe's witch hunts, the torture devices, the paranoia, the obsession with silencing women, still casts a shadow across the modern world. The devices themselves remain, frozen in time. Behind glass in museums across Germany, France, and England, visitors still stare at the iron chair studded with spikes. The pair of anguish twisted open like a grotesque flower. The scold's bridle with its cruel tongue spike. These objects, once instruments of terror, are now artifacts of shame. But they are not silent. They whisper warnings to anyone who dares to listen. This happened, and it can happen again. The legacy of the witch hunts is not confined to history books. It shaped how Europe treated women for centuries. Midwives and healers, the ones who understood herbs and childbirth, had been systematically destroyed, replaced by male-dominated institutions. Women's voices, once central in community life, were silenced by the memory of chains and iron masks. Even when the flames died, the cultural lesson endured: to speak too loudly, to live too independently, to step outside the role prescribed. These were dangerous acts. That shadow lingered in the way society viewed female ambition, sexuality, and power well into the modern era. But the witch hunts were not only about gender. They exposed a deeper truth: how fear, once unleashed, can consume entire societies. Neighbors turned on neighbors, friends betrayed friends, families broke under suspicion. Communities were taught that safety lay not in solidarity, but in accusation. And when those accusations were backed by authority, by priests, princes, and judges, the machinery of cruelty seemed unstoppable. Is it so different today? The devices may no longer crush bone or pierce flesh, But the logic of the witch hunt lives on. When fear becomes a tool, when societies turn against the vulnerable, when power is consolidated by creating enemies out of the defenseless, we are repeating the same patterns. The word witch hunt echoes in politics, in media, in courtrooms. It has become a metaphor precisely because the lesson has never fully been learned. Consider how scandals spread in the digital age. A rumor, an accusation, a whisper online can ignite into a firestorm that destroys reputations, careers, even lives. The tools are no longer iron and rope, but algorithms and screens. Yet the principle is disturbingly familiar. Confession is demanded, guilt is assumed, and silence is impossible. Just as the scold's bridle once punished women for speaking too freely, so too can social backlash muzzle voices today. The witch hunts also remind us how easily morality can be weaponized. In the 16th and 17th centuries, inquisitors framed their cruelty as holy duty. Today, governments, movements, and even corporations can cloak suppression in the language of virtue or security. When authority insists that cruelty is necessary for the greater good, the iron chair and the rack are closer than we think. Not in form, but in spirit. And yet, there is another legacy. The horror of the witch trials forced later generations to reckon with their brutality. Out of the ashes came questions of law, of justice, of human rights. Thinkers of the Enlightenment confronted the madness of torture and superstition, pushing Europe toward rationality and reform. The witch hunts became a cautionary tale, proof of the danger of unchecked fear, of blind obedience, of systems that trade humanity for control. What then should we take from this story? Perhaps the most chilling truth is that the witch hunts were not the work of monsters, but of ordinary people. Craftsmen who forged the devices, judges who signed the warrants, villagers who looked away. The line between civilization and barbarity is thinner than we like to believe. It does not take demons to unleash cruelty. It only takes fear, authority, and silence. And so we return to the question, what other secrets lie buried in history? The iron masks, the broken bodies, the confessions wrung from pain. These are not only echoes of the past. They are warnings. Warnings that fear once sanctified becomes cruelty. Warnings that power, once unchecked, becomes tyranny. Warnings that ordinary people, when complicit, can become executioners. The women branded as witches were not monsters. They were mothers, daughters, healers, neighbors. They were erased not because of what they did, but because of what they represented. Voices that could not be controlled, lives that could not be contained. Their silence was forced by iron. Our silence today is chosen if we ignore their legacy. The pyres are gone. But the lesson remains. Whenever society justifies cruelty in the name of righteousness, the witch hunt has returned. And so we end where we began, in the square, with a woman in chains. The faces of the crowd may have changed. The devices may have rusted away. But the question still burns. If you had stood there, what would you have done?